Sergeant First Class Roxanne Kingsley stood at attention in a community center folding chair, wearing the only blazer she owned, and the man across the table looked at her like she'd wandered in from the parking lot. "This is a formal arbitration hearing, ma'am. Not a job fair." Grady Kessler didn't even look up from his legal pad. "Do you have counsel, or are you representing yourself?" "I'm representing my grandfather," Roxanne said. "Solomon Kingsley." Kessler smiled the way men smile when they've already won something and just haven't announced it yet. "Then I suggest you find him a lawyer. Fast." Somebody near the back of the room laughed low and quick, the kind of laugh people think nobody hears. Roxanne heard it. She'd heard worse in places that smelled like diesel and gun oil, so a folding chair chuckle from a homeowners association hearing wasn't going to move her. She sat down, set a plain manila folder on the table in front of her, and folded her hands on top of it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Nobody in that room knew yet that the folder held 3 pieces of paper that would end Grady Kessler's career before the leaves changed color. This is the story of how a 29-year-old with a bad knee, a discharge packet, and a habit of writing everything down took apart a fraud that had already swallowed 4 families before hers. Let's get into it. Bethel Creek, North Carolina, sits about 40 minutes from Fort Liberty, close enough that half the town has a relative in uniform and the other half rents rooms to soldiers' families. It's the kind of place with one stoplight, a Baptist church on every third corner, and a creek that floods the low road every spring without fail. On the east side of town, past the feed store and the last stretch of paved road, there's a strip of land called Kingsley Bend. 4 acres of red clay, loblolly pines, and a single-story brick house with a wraparound porch that Solomon Kingsley built with his own hands in 1971. Solomon bought that land the year he came home from Vietnam. 2 tours as a combat engineer, a Purple Heart he never talked about, and a discharge check that covered exactly half of what the land cost. He worked the loading docks at the textile mill for the other half, 6 days a week, for 4 years, until the deed was paid off clean. He used to tell Roxanne, when she was small and sitting on his knee on that same porch, "Nobody gave me this ground. I earned it twice, once with a rifle and once with a paycheck. Don't you ever let anybody tell you different." Roxanne's father, August Kingsley, grew up on that porch. He went into the Army, too, made staff sergeant, married a school teacher named Ruth, and had one daughter he used to call Little Ranger because she followed him everywhere in oversized combat boots. August died in a highway accident when Roxanne was 19, halfway through her second year at community college. Solomon didn't say much at the funeral. He just held her hand the whole service and afterward told her the land was half hers now, on paper and otherwise, because that's what August would have wanted. Roxanne enlisted 8 months later. She did 2 deployments, one to Afghanistan as a combat medic attached to a military police unit, one to a NATO rotation in Poland doing convoy security, and, later, criminal investigations work she still doesn't talk about much. She made staff sergeant at 26. She could read a supply manifest, a chain of custody log, and a liar's face with about the same level of precision. In her 3rd year, an IED took out a vehicle 2 trucks ahead of hers outside Kandahar. She didn't lose a limb. She lost about 40% of the hearing in her left ear and enough cartilage in her right knee that the Army medically separated her 18 months later. She came home to Bethel Creek in March, planning to figure out what came next. She did not plan on walking into a lawsuit. The certified letter arrived at the brick house on a Thursday. Solomon read it twice at the kitchen table, then set it down and didn't say anything for a long time. Roxanne picked it up herself. Beaumont Ridge Holdings, LLC, was suing to force a partition sale of Kingsley Bend. The filing claimed that Roxanne Kingsley, co-owner of record since her father's death, had executed a deed transferring her half interest in the property to Beaumont Ridge 14 months earlier, in exchange for $80,000. With her half signed away, the company's lawyers argued, Solomon could be compelled by the court to sell the whole parcel because a co-owner had the legal right to force a sale. "I never signed that," Roxanne said. Her voice was flat the way it gets when she's controlling something instead of feeling it. "Grandpa, I never signed anything." "I know it, baby." Solomon's hands were folded on the table, steady despite the letter shaking slightly under them. "I know it same as I know my own name." 14 months earlier, Roxanne Kingsley had been on a rotation in Poznan, Poland, doing 13-hour shifts running convoy security details out of a forward staging area. She had a stack of leave and earnings statements, unit orders, and a passport full of entry and exit stamps that put her on the other side of an ocean the entire month the deed was supposedly signed. She just didn't know yet how badly Beaumont Ridge was going to need her to not notice that. Bethel Creek wasn't paying attention to the Kingsleys. Bethel Creek was paying attention to Franklin Beaumont, because Franklin Beaumont was the reason half the town had a new grocery store, a new gas station, and a billboard on Route 9 advertising Ridgeview Estates, luxury living, coming 2027. Beaumont owned the land on 3 sides of Kingsley Bend already. He needed the 4th side to finish the parcel, and he'd been trying to buy Solomon out for 2 years. Polite letters at first, then less polite ones, then a man in a golf shirt who showed up uninvited twice to discuss options. Solomon had said no every time. "This land is paid for twice," he told Beaumont's man the 2nd time, standing on his own porch with his arms crossed. "It's not for sale, and it's not up for discussion." Grady Kessler was Beaumont Ridge's attorney, 56 years old, 31 years of real estate litigation. An office on Main Street with his name in brass letters 2 inches tall. He hadn't lost a property case in 11 years. Before Kingsley Bend, 4 other black-owned parcels along the same stretch of Bethel Creek had gone the same way. Quiet pressure, tangled paperwork, families who couldn't afford to fight long enough to win. Kessler handled every one of those cases personally. Solomon Kingsley was the last holdout. Roxanne started calling law firms the next morning. 8 of them in Bethel Creek and the surrounding county. The first said they had a conflict of interest, which meant Beaumont Ridge was already a client. The second said the same thing in gentler words. The third didn't even pretend. "Ma'am, if Grady Kessler's on the other side of this, you're better off finding someone 2 counties over." Firms 4 and 5 wanted retainers she couldn't touch, $6,000, $7,500, just to open a file. Firm 6 never called back. Firm 7's receptionist listened to the whole story, sounded genuinely sorry, and told her the earliest consultation was in 5 weeks. The hearing date, set by the court, was in 18 days. She tried the County Veterans Assistance Office. They could help with benefits claims, disability appeals, housing vouchers. Real estate fraud litigation was outside their scope, the woman on the phone explained. But she gave Roxanne a number for a legal aid nonprofit 2 hours away. Roxanne called. The recorded message said their intake list for new property cases was closed until the fall. 8 calls, 8 closed doors, more or less politely shut. Meanwhile, Beaumont Ridge moved fast. 6 days after the lawsuit was filed, a white pickup pulled into the gravel drive at Kingsley Bend. 2 men got out with a surveyor's tripod and a stack of orange flags. They walked the property line like it already belonged to somebody else. Driving stakes into the red clay, near the old oak Solomon had planted the year Roxanne was born. Solomon watched from the porch, jaw set, saying nothing. That night his blood pressure spiked high enough that Roxanne drove him to Bethel Creek General at 11 o'clock, hazard lights blinking the whole way. They kept him overnight for observation. Stress cardiomyopathy, the doctor called it. A heart that reacts to fear the same way it reacts to a physical blow. Solomon was 74 years old, sitting in a hospital gown, because 2 men with a tripod had walked his land like he was already gone from it. Otha Bramwell showed up at the hospital the next afternoon with a thermos of coffee and knees that took their time getting out of the truck. 71 years old, lived 3 houses down from the Kingsleys for the better part of 4 decades. They did the Vance place the same way, Otha said, settling into the plastic chair beside Solomon's bed. Papers that woman swore she never touched. By the time her nephew found somebody to look at it close, the bulldozers were already sitting on the lot. He looked at Roxanne. Your granddaddy's the last one on this side of the creek. They get this land. That whole stretch belongs to Beaumont. Roxanne didn't answer. She sat in the vinyl chair by the window, with a legal pad on her knee, the same kind of pad she used to fill out incident reports in a tent in Kandahar. Name, date, time, sequence of events, no adjectives, just facts stacked in order until the shape of the truth showed up on its own. That night, after the hospital released Solomon, and she'd gotten him settled back on the porch with a glass of water and his blood pressure medication, Roxanne sat alone in her truck in the driveway, engine off, windows up, and for the first time since the letter arrived, she let herself cry. Not loud, not for long, just her forehead against the steering wheel and her shoulders shaking in the dark, because she was 29 years old and had survived things most people in this county couldn't picture. And none of it had prepared her for watching an $80,000 lie try to take the only home her father ever had, because she'd spent 3 years being trained to notice everything, and the one document that mattered most she hadn't even known existed until it showed up trying to erase her signature from a life she'd never signed away. She was still sitting there when the porch light clicked on, and Solomon came down the steps slower than he used to, one hand on the rail, and opened the passenger door. He didn't say it's going to be fine. He'd never been a man for saying things he couldn't back up. He just sat down next to her in the dark and put his hand over hers on the steering wheel, the way he had when she was small and scared of thunderstorms. After a while, she wiped her face and said, "I don't even know where to start." "You already started," Solomon said. "You just don't see it yet." Roxanne looked at him. "You spent 3 years reading other people's paperwork for a living," he said. "Manifests, orders, chain of custody, whatever they call it. You're telling me you can track a shipment of tires through 6 countries, but you can't track one signature through one county." Something shifted behind Roxanne's eyes, the same click she used to feel reviewing a supply discrepancy report at 2 in the morning, when a number that shouldn't have moved. "I was in Poland," she said, slowly. "The whole month that deed says I was here signing something. I have orders. I have a passport. I have a leave and earnings statement with a Polish per diem code on it." So nobody can be in 2 places at once, Grandpa. Not even with a good lawyer. She sat up straighter. "They didn't forge my signature carefully enough to think about where I actually was. That's what I love about this story. I've watched trained professionals miss things. A scared 29-year-old with a legal pad caught in one night, because she knew exactly what kind of proof holds up and what kind falls apart the second somebody checks it. She started the next morning before sunrise, laptop open on the same kitchen table where the lawsuit letter had landed. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't need to be one. Not yet. She needed to be an investigator, and that part of her training hadn't gone anywhere. She pulled her own personnel file first. Official orders assigning her to the Poznan rotation, dated and stamped, covering the exact window the deed claimed she'd been in Bethel Creek signing paperwork in front of a notary. She requested a certified copy of her passport entry and exit stamps from that period. A 2-day wait through the State Department's expedited request line, but a 2-day wait she could survive. She pulled her leave and earnings statement showing a foreign per diem code active the entire month in question, which the Army does not issue to soldiers who are, in fact, standing in a title company's office in North Carolina. Then she went after the deed itself. Beaumont Ridge's filing included a copy, signed and notarized, with a raised seal from a notary named Wendell Crouch. Roxanne pulled up the North Carolina Secretary of State's Notary Public Database, public record, searchable by anyone with an internet connection, and the patience to use it correctly. She typed in Wendell Crouch's name and commission number. Suspended. 11 months before the date on the deed. Complaint on file, notarizing a signature without the signer physically present, on an unrelated transaction 2 counties over. She sat back in her chair and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a week. 3 other names from Otha Bramwell's story. 3 other families who'd lost land along the creek kept surfacing in her mind. She pulled county deed records for 2 of them, cross-referencing notary seals. Wendell Crouch's stamp showed up on both. This wasn't one bad signature. This was a pattern, and patterns are exactly what a criminal investigation's background teaches you to see. She still needed a lawyer to actually stand in front of a judge, but every consultation she scheduled ran into the same wall, either a conflict of interest, or a fee she couldn't cover, or a firm too cautious to go up against Grady Kessler's win record. With 11 days left before the hearing, she called the County Veterans Service Office back and asked, differently this time, if anyone knew of legal aid specifically for service members dealing with fraud committed while they were deployed. That question led to a name, the Veterans Legal Defense Network, a small nonprofit that specialized in exactly one thing: protecting deployed service members from exploitation of their absence. Their regional coordinator, a retired Army colonel named Renee Ashcombe, called Roxanne back within 4 hours of the intake form going in. "You have documentation of your deployment dates?" Colonel Ashcombe asked. "Orders, passport stamps, LES records, and a suspended notary commission that matches 3 other properties on the same street," Roxanne said. There was a pause on the line. "I'm going to be honest with you, Sergeant. Most of the people who call this line have a story and not much paper behind it. You have a case file. Give me 48 hours. 2 days later, Colonel Ashcombe, now acting as co-counsel alongside a staff attorney from the network, filed a formal appearance in the case, and the hearing was recharacterized from a homeowners association arbitration into a full quiet title challenge before a superior court judge. Grady Kessler, according to the courthouse clerk, was not pleased about the change of venue. Which brings us back to that folding chair. The Bethel Creek County Courthouse was a squat brick building with a single courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old paper. Judge Renata Osgood presided, mid-50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back tight, a reputation around the county for asking exactly one more question than lawyers wanted her to. Grady Kessler opened smoothly, the way a man does when he's argued the same kind of case 100 times and expects the 101st to go the same way. He walked the court through the deed, the notarization, the $80,000 payment record Beaumont Ridge claimed to have wired, though notably to an account that turned out to belong to a shell entity, not to Roxanne herself, a detail Colonel Ashcombe flagged for the record without yet playing her full hand. Monsieur Kingsley signed away her interest in this property 14 months ago, Kessler told the judge, gesturing at Roxanne without quite looking at her. My client has acted in complete good faith based on a validly executed and notarized instrument. Judge Osgood turned to the defense table. Colonel Ashcombe, your witness? Ashcombe stood, calm as still water. Your Honor, at this time I'd like Sergeant Kingsley to address the court directly on the matter of her whereabouts during the period in question. Roxanne stood, Grady Kessler's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, the same expression he'd worn at the folding table 3 weeks earlier. Your Honor, Kessler said, with respect, I'd prefer to hear from counsel, not. I'd like to hear from Sergeant Kingsley, Judge Osgood said, without raising her voice. Go ahead. Roxanne walked to the small lectern set up in front of the bench. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She didn't need one. She set the manila folder down and opened it. On the date this deed claims I signed away my interest in Kingsley Bend, I was stationed at a forward operating base outside Poznan, Poland, on a NATO security rotation. Her voice didn't shake. It had been trained not to. I have my official deployment orders here, Your Honor, stamped by my unit's personnel office. I have certified copies of my passport, showing an exit stamp from the United States 11 days before the signing date, and an entry stamp back into the country 19 days after it. I have my leave and earnings statement for that period, which reflects a foreign per diem, a payment the United States Army does not issue to a soldier who is physically present in North Carolina. She laid each document on the lectern as she spoke, the way Solomon used to lay out lesson plans on a table when he still taught Sunday school. Judge Osgood leaned forward slightly. I was not in this county, Your Honor. I was not in this country. I could not have stood in front of a notary and signed anything on that date, because I was 13 time zones away on duty. Kessler was on his feet. Your Honor, deployment records can be. Dates get misfiled, translated incorrectly across systems. There are numerous. There's a fourth document, Roxanne said, and something in her tone made Kessler stop mid-sentence. The notary whose seal appears on this deed, Wendell Crouch, had his commission suspended by the North Carolina Secretary of State 11 months before the date on this document. Under state law, that makes any notarization he performed after that date void. I'd also note his same seal appears on 2 other property transfers on this same stretch of Kingsley Bend Road, both involving black families who no longer own that land. The courtroom had gone very quiet. Judge Osgood's expression hadn't changed, but she'd stopped writing. If this deed were genuine, Your Honor, Roxanne continued, it wouldn't need explaining. A real signature from a real person, notarized by someone actually licensed to do it, would hold up against every record the United States government keeps on its own soldiers. This one doesn't hold up against a single one of them. She looked at Kessler for the first time. So I only have one question for opposing counsel. If you had a document this clean, why did your client's payment go to a company that isn't me, notarized by a man who couldn't legally notarize anything? Kessler opened his mouth. Nothing came out. 31 years of winning arguments, and Grady Kessler could not produce a single word. I'm not going to lie to you. The silence in that courtroom did something to the room's temperature. You could hear the air conditioning kick on in the back wall. Judge Osgood took off her glasses, cleaned them slowly, put them back on. Mr. Kessler, I'll ask you directly. Was Wendell Crouch's commission active at the time this deed was executed? Your Honor, I would need to. My client handled the notarization arrangements. I wasn't personally. That's not an answer to my question. Kessler said nothing. Judge Osgood looked down at the documents for a long moment. The deployment orders, the passport, the per diem record, the suspended notary printout, 4 pieces of paper laid out like a puzzle that had already solved itself. I've heard enough, she said. The court finds that the purported deed transfer from Roxanne Kingsley to Beaumont Ridge Holdings is void on multiple independent grounds. First, the notarization was performed by an individual whose commission had been suspended 11 months prior, which, under North Carolina law, renders the notarization and the instrument itself invalid on its face. Second, the government deployment and travel records submitted by the defense establish, to a certainty this court finds conclusive, that Sergeant Kingsley was outside the United States on the date the signature purports to have been executed. She looked directly at Kessler. The partition action is dismissed with prejudice. Miss Kingsley's interest in the Kingsley Bend property is confirmed as never having transferred. Further, this court is referring this matter to the North Carolina State Bar for investigation into potential fraud and professional misconduct, and to the Secretary of State's office regarding the notary violations which appear, based on the pattern counsel for the defense has now placed on the record, to extend beyond this single transaction. The gavel came down once, sharp and final. For a second, nobody moved. Then Otha Bramwell, sitting 3 rows back with his cap in his lap, stood up slowly the way a man with bad knees stands when something matters enough to hurt for. He clapped once, then again. The woman beside him stood, then the row behind her. It wasn't a movie moment, it was a dozen people in a small brick courthouse in a small Carolina town, and it sounded like the whole county had finally started paying attention. Solomon Kingsley sat in the gallery, with tears running down into the collar of his good shirt, the same shirt he'd worn to church every Sunday for 15 years. Roxanne walked back to him, and he pulled her down into a hug that nearly knocked the wind out of her. 62 years on that land, he said into her shoulder. First time I ever watched somebody make it stick. Grady Kessler packed his briefcase without looking at anyone. He walked out through the side door. In the hallway, he passed Otha Bramwell, standing by the water fountain. Otha didn't say a word. He just looked at him with 40 years of Kingsley Bend Road in his eyes, and Kessler kept walking. Colonel Renee Ashcombe waited until the courtroom had mostly cleared, then walked over and shook Roxanne's hand. I've supervised second-year law students who couldn't build a case file like the one you handed me, she said. I mean that. She reached into her jacket and handed Roxanne a card. The Veterans Legal Defense Network runs a fellowship, full tuition, law school, with a guaranteed judge-advocate track if you want it. I'd like to talk to you about applying. Roxanne looked at the card, then at her grandfather. Solomon smiled, the kind of smile that starts slow and takes over a whole face. Go on, he said. Answer the woman. 6 months later, Roxanne Kingsley started her first semester of law school on a full fellowship, with a standing offer waiting for her at the Judge Advocate General's Corps the day she passed the bar. She kept a legal pad in her bag out of habit. Name, date, sequence of events, no adjectives. Same way she'd kept one in a tent outside Kandahar. Back on Kingsley Bend, the porch light still comes on every evening at dusk. Solomon still sits out there most mornings with his coffee, watching the oak tree his son used to climb do exactly what it's done for 55 years, grow. 2 of the other families who'd lost land to Wendell Crouch's suspended stamp reached out to the Veterans Legal Defense Network after the ruling made the local paper. Their cases are open now. Franklin Beaumont Ridge Holdings quietly withdrew its remaining claims along the creek, and hasn't broken ground on Ridgeview Estates since. Grady Kessler is under formal investigation by the state bar, and nobody in Bethel Creek talks about him the way they used to. Roxanne Kingsley didn't have a law degree. She didn't have a courtroom voice trained by 30 years of practice. She had deployment orders, a legal pad, a grandfather who taught her that land earned twice doesn't get taken with a piece of paper once. And one question that a man with 3 decades of winning never saw coming. If this story got to you, you already know what to do. Hit subscribe because there are more like this one coming, and this channel only exists because people keep showing up for them. Send this to somebody who's ever been underestimated the second they walked into a room. And leave a comment. Tell me if you'd have had the nerve to stand at that lectern at 29 years old with your whole family's home on the line. We'll see you in the next one.